The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large windows of Denver International Airport when Rosa stepped through the automatic doors. She pulled her small black suitcase behind her, the wheels making that familiar clicking sound. On the polished floor. At 78 years old, Rosa had learned to arrive at airports early. Her joints weren't as quick as they used to be, and she didn't want to rush through security like she saw younger people doing. Today was special. After months of planning and saving, she was finally going to see her granddaughter graduate from college. Little Anna would be the first person in their family to get a university degree. Rosa's heart swelled with pride just thinking about it. She had her boarding pass printed at home and tucked safely in her purse, along with her identification and the usual collection of things that seemed to multiply in elderly women's handbags. The airport was already busy, even though it was still early. Business travelers rushed past with their sleek laptops and coffee cups, while families with young children struggled with strollers and diaper bags. Rosa moved at her own pace, taking in the familiar chaos of modern travel. She remembered when flying used to be different, more formal somehow. People dressed up for flights back then, and there weren't all these security measures. As she approached the security checkpoint, Rosa felt the usual flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She had flown several times over the years, but the whole process still made her a bit anxious. All those rules about liquids and electronics, the need to remove shoes and belts. It seemed like every time she flew, there was something new to remember. The line moved steadily forward. Rosa watched the people ahead of her, trying to remember everything she needed to do. Take out her laptop, remove her shoes, put everything in the gray plastic bins. She had worn slip-on shoes specifically for this reason, having learned that lesson on previous trips. No point in struggling with laces when there were so many people waiting behind you. When her turn came, Rosa smiled politely at the SA officer directing the line. He was a young man, probably around her grandson's age, with kind eyes and a patient expression. She appreciated when security staff were understanding with older passengers. Some of them seemed so serious and rushed, but this one gestured gently toward the bins and even helped her lift her carry-on bag onto the conveyor belt. Rosa had packed carefully the night before, just like she always did. Her medications were in a clear plastic bag, her reading glasses in their case, a small pillow for the flight, and a few snacks in case the airline food wasn't to her liking. She had also packed a sweater because airplanes were always too cold, and a small photo album to show Anna's roommates and friends. Grandmothers always carried photos, she thought with a smile. The security officer behind the X-ray machine was focused on his screen, watching as bags and belongings moved through the scanner. Rosa's bag appeared on his monitor, and he leaned forward slightly, studying the image. Something had caught his attention. It wasn't unusual for bags to need a second look, especially bags belonging to older travelers who sometimes forgot about metal objects or liquids in their luggage. Officer Chun had been working airport security for 3 years now. He had seen everything from forgotten pocket knives to bottles of expensive perfume that exceeded the liquid limits. Most of the time, it was innocent mistakes. People simply forgot what they had packed, or they weren't familiar with all the security rules. He had learned to be patient and professional, especially with elderly passengers who sometimes became flustered when their bags were selected for additional screening, but something about this particular image on his screen made him pause. There was a small, dense object in the bag that he couldn't quite identify from the X-ray alone. It appeared to be in some kind of case or container, nestled between what looked like pill bottles and other personal items. Protocol required him to physically inspect anything he couldn't clearly identify on the screen. Rosa noticed when her bag didn't come out the other end of the conveyor belt with the other luggage. She saw the officer motioning for her to step aside to a secondary screening area. Her heart rate picked up slightly. She hoped she hadn't forgotten to remove something she wasn't supposed to have. Flying rules were so complicated these days. The secondary screening area was set up with a stainless steel table, where officers could manually inspect bags that needed closer examination. Rosa watched as Officer Chun approached with her carry-on bag, his expression professional but not unkind. He explained that they needed to take a look inside her bag, that it was routine, nothing to worry about. Rosa nodded and tried to stay calm. She watched as the officer put on gloves and began carefully removing items from her bag. First came her medications, then her reading glasses, the small pillow, her snacks. Everything was placed neatly on the table, and Rosa was grateful that he was being so careful with her belongings. Other passengers moved through the regular security lines nearby, most of them unaware of the secondary screening happening just a few feet away. The airport hummed with its usual activity, announcements echoing overhead about departing flights and gate changes. But in this small area beside the main checkpoint, time seemed to slow down as the officer continued his methodical search. Rosa's nervousness began to ease as she realized this was indeed just routine. The officer was being respectful and thorough, explaining what he was doing as he went. She had nothing to hide, nothing dangerous or prohibited in her bag. Just the usual things an elderly woman might carry on a trip to see family, but then the officer's hands found something at the bottom of her bag, wrapped carefully in a soft cloth and tucked beneath her other belongings. His fingers traced the outline of a small rectangular case. It was heavier than its size suggested, and there was something about the way it was packed that indicated its importance to the travel officer. Chun lifted the cloth-wrapped object from the bag, feeling its weight and substance. Whatever was inside this careful wrapping was clearly precious to this elderly woman. He looked up at Rosa, who was watching him with an expression that had shifted from nervousness to something deeper, more complex. There was emotion in her eyes now, a mixture of sadness and pride that he couldn't quite understand. The officer gently began to unwrap the cloth, taking care not to damage whatever was inside. The fabric was soft and worn, as if it had been handled many times over many years. As the cloth fell away, a small leather case was revealed. It was old but well-maintained, with a dignity and gravitas that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of an airport security checkpoint. The case had a simple clasp, and Officer Chun paused before opening it. Something told him that whatever was inside was more than just a piece of jewelry or a family heirloom. There was a weight to this moment that went beyond routine security procedures. He glanced again at Rosa, who gave him a small nod, as if giving him permission to continue. When Officer Chun opened the case, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was something he had only seen in museums and history books. The distinctive star-shaped metal gleamed softly under the fluorescent lights of the security checkpoint, its ribbons faded but still vibrant with their characteristic blue and white stripes. Time seemed to stop completely as the young officer stared at the contents of the case. His training hadn't prepared him for this moment. All around them, the airport continued its busy rhythm, but in this small space, something extraordinary had just been revealed. Officer Chun stared at the metal in complete silence. His hands, which had been moving confidently through the routine search just moments before, now trembled slightly as he held the small leather case. The distinctive blue and white striped ribbon, the star-shaped metal with its eagle and shield design, there was no mistaking what he was looking at. This was the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor in combat. The young officer had grown up in a military family. His grandfather had served in Korea, his father in Desert Storm. He had heard stories around the dinner table about heroes and sacrifice, about men and women who went above and beyond the call of duty. But he had never imagined he would actually hold one of these medals in his hands, especially not during a routine bag check at an airport security line. For a moment, Chun forgot where he was. The busy sounds of the airport seemed to fade into the background. The announcements over the loudspeakers, the rolling of suitcase wheels on the polished floor, the chatter of travelers, it all became distant white noise. His entire focus was on this small piece of metal and fabric that represented something so much larger than itself. Rosa watched the officer's reaction with a mixture of understanding and sadness. She had seen that same expression many times over the years when people discovered what her husband had carried with him until the day he died. It was always the same: first confusion, then recognition, then a kind of reverence that people couldn't quite hide. The medal had that effect on people, especially those who understood what it meant. "Sir, is everything okay?" The voice came. From behind Chun, he turned to see his supervisor, Maria Rodriguez, approaching the secondary screening table. Rodriguez had been working airport security for over a decade and had seen her share of unusual discoveries. But she could tell from Chun's expression that something significant was happening here. Chun couldn't find his voice for a moment. He simply held up the open case, tilting it slightly so Rodriguez could see the contents. When her eyes fell on the medal, her reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her professional composure faltered for just a second, and her hand moved instinctively to her heart. Rodriguez had served in the Air Force before joining TSA. She knew military history, knew the stories of the brave men and women who had earned this nation's highest honor. She also knew how rare it was to encounter one of these medals. Only about 3,500 had been awarded since the Civil War, and many of them were in museums or had been buried with their recipients. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said softly, turning to Rosa with a respect that hadn't been there moments before. "Can you tell us about this?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but she maintained her composure. She had told this story many times, but it never got easier. The memories were still fresh, even after all these years. She cleared her throat gently and began to speak in a voice that was steady but filled with emotion. "That belonged to my husband," she said simply. "Miguel was his name. He served in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division." She paused, gathering herself. "He earned that medal in 1968, during the Tet Offensive." The airport continued its busy rhythm around them, but their small corner of the security checkpoint had become something different. Other TSA officers began to notice that something unusual was happening. Word started to spread quietly through their ranks. A few passengers in nearby lines began to glance over. Sensing that this wasn't a typical security delay, Rodriguez had moved closer to the table, her eyes fixed on the medal. She could see the inscription on the back, though she couldn't make out all the words from where she stood. Every Medal of Honor was unique, engraved with the recipient's name and the date and location of their heroic actions. "What happened?" Rodriguez asked gently. She wasn't just making conversation. She genuinely wanted to know, needed to know. There was something about being in the presence of this medal that demanded respect. That made the everyday concerns of airport security seem trivial in comparison. Rosa took a deep breath. Miguel's unit was ambushed during a patrol near Saigon. They were pinned down by enemy fire, and several men were wounded. Miguel could have stayed in cover, could have waited for backup. She paused, her voice becoming stronger. But he didn't. He ran through enemy fire 3 times to pull wounded soldiers to safety. The 3rd time he was hit himself, but he kept going until every last man was safe. June found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word. He had read about actions like this in history books, but hearing it from the widow of the hero himself made it real in a way that textbooks never could. This wasn't ancient history. This was sitting right here in front of him, carried by an elderly woman who was just trying to catch a flight to see her granddaughter. 12 men, Rosa continued. Miguel saved 12 men that day. Some of them were just boys, barely 18 years old. They all made it home because of what my husband did. Her voice broke slightly. Miguel spent 6 months in the hospital, but he recovered. The medal was presented to him by President Johnson himself in 1969. Rodriguez felt a chill run down her spine. She was looking at a piece of living history, a tangible connection to an act of extraordinary courage that had happened more than 50 years ago. But more than that, she was looking at the love and devotion of a woman who had carried her husband's legacy with her. For all these years, other passengers had begun to notice the unusual scene at the security checkpoint. A businessman who had been impatiently checking his watch suddenly found himself drawn to the quiet conversation happening near the screening table. A young mother with 2 small children paused her efforts to keep them entertained and looked. Over with curiosity, Chun realized that his hands were still shaking slightly. He had never felt such a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a medal, it was a sacred trust, a physical representation of sacrifice and heroism that deserved to be treated with the utmost care and respect. "Where are you traveling with it today?" Rodriguez asked, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Rosa smiled for the first time since the search had begun. "I'm going to see my granddaughter graduate from college. Ana's getting her degree in nursing. She wants to help people just like her grandfather did." Rosa's pride was evident in every word. Miguel always said education was the key to a better life. He would have been so proud to see Ana graduate. Since he can't be there himself, I'm bringing a piece of him with me. The simple beauty of that statement hit both officers like a physical force. Here was a woman in her late 70s, traveling across the country to celebrate her granddaughter's achievement, carrying with her the most precious thing she owned. A medal that represented her husband's courage and sacrifice, but also their shared hopes and dreams for the next generation. Rodriguez looked around and noticed that their small area had drawn the attention of several other airport employees. A maintenance worker had stopped his cart nearby and was listening to the conversation. 2 gate agents had walked over during their break. Even some passengers had formed a small, respectful crowd around the security checkpoint. The medal sat open in its case on the metal table, catching the fluorescent light. It seemed almost to glow with its own inner dignity. Jun realized that in all his years of security work, he had never encountered anything that commanded such immediate and universal respect. People didn't need to be told what they were looking at. They could feel its importance. The crowd around the security checkpoint continued to grow, but it wasn't the usual kind of airport gathering. There was no impatience, no frustrated sighs or checking of watches. Instead, people stood quietly, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Word was spreading through the terminal in whispers. An elderly woman was traveling with her husband's Medal of Honor, and she was telling his story. Rosa noticed the growing audience, but didn't seem bothered by it. If anything, she appeared to welcome the opportunity to share Miguel's story. She had spent so many years keeping his memory alive, telling anyone who would listen about the man she had loved and lost. Each time she told the story, it kept him a little more present in the world. A young soldier in uniform had approached the edge of the crowd. He was clearly on leave, traveling in his dress blues, probably heading home to see family. When he heard Rosa mention Vietnam and the Medal of Honor, he had stopped walking and moved closer. Now he stood at attention, even though he wasn't required to. His face serious and respectful, Officer Rodriguez felt the weight of the moment settling around them all. She had handled thousands of routine security checks, dealt with countless frustrated passengers, and maintained order through every kind of travel crisis imaginable. But this was different. This felt like something that mattered beyond the normal scope of airport operations. "Mrs. Rosa," Rodriguez said gently, "would you mind telling us more about your husband? About what happened that day?" Rosa's eyes brightened. She loved talking about Miguel, especially when people genuinely wanted to listen. She glanced around at the faces surrounding her, airport workers, travelers, security officers, all of them focused on her with an attention that felt almost sacred. "Miguel was just 22 when it happened," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed space. "He had been in Vietnam for 8 months. He wrote to me every week, told me about his buddies in his unit. They were like brothers to him. Tony from Chicago, David from Texas, a young boy named Jimmy who was only 19 and talked about his mother's cooking all the time." The businessman who had been checking his watch earlier found himself completely absorbed in Rosa's words. His own grandfather had served in World War II, but had never talked much about his experiences. Hearing Rosa speak so openly about her husband's service felt like a gift, a window into a part of history that was slowly disappearing as veterans passed away. On that morning in February 1968, Miguel's platoon was on what they called a routine patrol, Rosa continued, but nothing was routine in Vietnam. They were moving through a village near Saigon when the shooting started. The enemy had been waiting for them, hiding in the buildings and in the jungle just outside the village. Chun found himself thinking about his own grandfather's stories from Korea. The old man had talked about the fear, the confusion, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, but he had never described anything as dramatic as what Rosa was sharing now. The first burst of gunfire hit 3 of Miguel's friends, Rosa said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. They were out in the open, no cover, and the enemy fire was coming from multiple directions. The rest of the platoon took cover behind a stone wall, but those 3 boys were trapped in the middle of the village square. A mother traveling with her teenage son had joined the crowd. The boy, probably around 16, was listening with wide eyes. His generation had grown up with video games and movies about war, but hearing a real story from someone who had lived through it was clearly having an impact on him. Miguel's sergeant told the men to stay down to wait for backup, Rosa continued. But Miguel could hear his friends calling for help. Tony had been shot in the leg and couldn't move. David was unconscious and Jimmy was crying for his mother. Rosa paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue she had pulled from her purse. The young soldier in dress blues stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, may I ask what unit your husband served with?" "1st Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion," Rosa replied. With pride, the big red one, they called themselves. Miguel was so proud of that patch on his uniform. The soldier nodded with recognition and respect. The 1st Infantry Division was legendary, with a history dating back to World War I. They had seen some of the heaviest fighting in Vietnam, and their casualty rates had been among the highest of any unit in the war. Miguel didn't wait for orders, Rosa continued. He told his sergeant he was going after his friends, and before anyone could stop him, he was running across that open square. The enemy fire was so heavy that his own men thought he wouldn't make it 10 feet. Rodriguez felt her heart racing as she listened. She could almost see the scene Rosa was describing, a young soldier running through deadly crossfire to save his comrades. It was the kind of courage that seemed almost impossible to imagine, except that the proof of it was sitting right there on the security table in its small leather case. He reached Tony first, Rosa said, grabbed him under the arms and dragged him back to the wall where the others were taking cover. Tony was bleeding badly, but he was conscious. Miguel didn't even pause. He turned around and ran back out for David. The crowd had grown to include several airline employees, a few off-duty pilots, and even some janitors who had stopped their work to listen. Airport security had quietly rerouted foot traffic around the area, creating a small bubble of space where Rosa could continue her story without interruption. The second trip was harder, Rosa continued. David was a big man, over 6 feet tall, and he was completely unconscious. Miguel had to lift him in a fireman's carry and run all the way back while bullets were hitting the ground all around him. His uniform was torn in 3 places where bullets had passed through the fabric without hitting him. Chun found himself holding his breath. He knew the story had to end with Miguel surviving, since Rosa had mentioned him living through the war, but the tension of the moment felt real and immediate. When Miguel got David to safety, everyone thought he was done, Rosa said. 2 rescues under enemy fire was already more than anyone could expect. But Jimmy was still out there, and he was hurt bad. Miguel could hear him calling for help, calling for his mother. The teenage boy in the crowd stepped closer to his mother, suddenly understanding in a way that no history textbook could teach him what war really meant. These weren't just statistics or dates to memorize. These were real people, barely older than himself, facing life and death situations thousands of miles from home. Miguel's sergeant actually tried to stop him from going back a 3rd time, Rosa said. The enemy fire was getting heavier, and they could see that Jimmy was badly wounded. It looked like a suicide mission. But Miguel said something that his sergeant never forgot, something he told me about when he visited us after the war. Rosa paused, looking around at all the faces focused on her, young and old, civilian and military, from all different backgrounds and walks of life, but all united in this moment by the power of one man's story of courage and sacrifice. Miguel looked at his sergeant and said, "That boy is somebody's son. He's going home." Then he ran back into that gunfire one more time. The silence that followed was profound. Even the usual airport announcements seemed to have paused, as if The entire terminal was holding its breath, waiting to hear the rest of Miguel's story. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. Every person in the crowd seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for Rosa to continue. The teenage boy had moved even closer to his mother, and the young soldier in dress blues stood so still he could have been a statue. Rosa looked down at the metal in its case, her fingers gently touching the worn velvet lining. Miguel ran across that square for the third time, and this time the enemy was ready for him. They had figured out what he was doing, and they concentrated all their fire on the path between Jimmy and the wall where his unit was taking cover. Officer Chun felt his heart pounding. He had never been in combat himself, but he could imagine the terror and chaos of that moment. A young man, barely older than Chun was now, making a conscious decision to risk everything for a friend. The bullets were so close that Miguel could feel them passing by his head, Rosa continued. Later, when they examined his uniform, they found 11 bullet holes. 11 times the enemy came within inches of killing him, but somehow he made it to Jimmy. Rodriguez noticed that more people were gathering around their small area. Word had spread through the terminal about what was happening at the security checkpoint. She saw airline pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and even some passengers who had missed their connecting flights but no longer seemed to care. There was something magnetic about Rosa's story, something that made all the usual concerns of air travel seem unimportant. Jimmy was in bad shape, Rosa said, her voice becoming softer. He had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the arm. He was barely conscious, but when he saw Miguel coming for him, he tried to smile. Miguel told me later that Jimmy whispered, "I knew you'd come back," when Miguel reached him. The mother, traveling with her son, felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She thought about her own boy, about how young these soldiers had been, about the incredible bonds of friendship and loyalty that had formed between them in such a terrible situation. Miguel picked Jimmy up and started running back toward safety, Rosa continued. But this time the enemy got lucky. A bullet hit Miguel in the shoulder, spinning him around. He almost dropped Jimmy, but somehow he held on. Another bullet grazed his leg, and he stumbled. The crowd had grown to include nearly 50 people now. Airport management had noticed the gathering and sent a supervisor to investigate. But when he heard what was happening, he quietly instructed security to allow the crowd to continue forming. This was clearly something special, something that transcended normal airport operations. Miguel was about halfway back to safety when he got hit again, Rosa said. This time it was serious, a bullet in his side that went clean through. He fell to his knees, still holding Jimmy, and everyone thought that was the end. His sergeant later said he was preparing to order the whole unit to charge across that square to try to save both of them. Officer Chung found himself thinking about his own friends, about the people he cared most about in the world. Would he have that kind of courage? Would he be willing to risk everything to save someone else? He honestly wasn't sure, and that uncertainty made Miguel's actions seem even more remarkable. But Miguel wasn't finished, Rosa said, her voice growing stronger again. Even wounded, even bleeding, he got back to his feet. He adjusted his grip on Jimmy and kept running. The enemy fire was still coming, but something had changed. Miguel's unit had started providing covering fire, and other American forces in the area had heard the battle and were moving to help. The young soldier in dress blues stepped forward again. "Ma'am, may I ask what happened next?" Rosa smiled at him. Miguel made it back to the wall with Jimmy. All 3 boys, Tony, David, and Jimmy, survived that day because of what my husband did. But Miguel collapsed as soon as he got them to safety. He had lost a lot of blood, and the medics weren't sure he was going to make it. The businessman who had been so concerned about his schedule earlier found himself completely absorbed in the story. He thought about his own life, about the things he worried about every day, meetings, deadlines, quarterly reports. None of it seemed very important compared to what he was hearing now. The doctors worked on Miguel for 6 hours, Rosa continued. He was unconscious for 3 days. When he finally woke up, the first thing he asked about wasn't his own injuries. He wanted to know if his friends were okay. Rodriguez felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen courage in her own military service, but nothing quite like what Rosa was describing. This was the kind of heroism that seemed to belong in movies, not in real life. But here was the proof, sitting on the security table in its small leather case. All three of the boys Miguel saved made it home from Vietnam, Rosa said. Tony recovered from his leg wound and became a teacher in Chicago. David went back to Texas and raised a family. And Jimmy, sweet Jimmy, who missed his mother so much, he became a doctor? He said Miguel's courage inspired him to spend his life helping people. The crowd had continued to grow, and Rosa could see that her story was having a profound effect on everyone listening. There were tears in many eyes, and even some of the toughest-looking airport workers seemed moved by what they were hearing. The Medal of Honor ceremony was held at the White House in 1969, Rosa continued. President Johnson himself presented the medal to Miguel. I was there, wearing my best dress, so proud I thought my heart might burst. Miguel was still using a cane from his injuries, but he stood as straight and tall as any soldier ever has. June realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the story Rosa was telling, but the effect it was having on everyone around them. In a world that often seemed divided and angry, here was a moment of unity, a shared recognition of something pure and good and heroic. The president read the citation aloud, Rosa said. It described everything Miguel had done that day, how he had saved 3 lives at the risk of his own, how he had shown conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But you know what Miguel said to me afterward? The crowd leaned in, eager to hear the rest. He said the medal wasn't really his, Rosa continued. He said it belonged to everyone who served, everyone who looked out for their buddies, everyone who tried to do the right thing even when it was dangerous. He said he was just lucky enough to be in a position where someone noticed. The young soldier in dress blues had tears in his eyes now. He understood something about military service that many civilians couldn't fully grasp, the bonds between soldiers, the willingness to sacrifice for each other. The way ordinary people could become heroes when circumstances demanded it. Rodriguez looked around at the crowd that had gathered. She had never seen anything like this in all her years of airport security. People from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all ages, united in their respect for one man's courage and one woman's devotion to keeping his memory alive. That's why I carry the medal with me today, Rosa said, looking around at all the faces focused on her. I'm going to see my granddaughter graduate from college. Ana's going to be a nurse. She wants to help people, just like her grandfather did. I wanted to bring a piece of Miguel with me so he could be there in spirit when Ana receives her diploma. The simple beauty of that statement hit the crowd like a wave. Here was a connection between past and present, between sacrifice and hope, between one generation's courage and another's dreams. The silence that followed Rosa's words was different from all the others. This wasn't the quiet of people waiting to hear more. This was the profound silence of people who had been deeply moved, who understood they had just witnessed something special. The crowd around the security checkpoint had grown to nearly 100 people, and every single one of them seemed to be processing what they had just heard. Officer Chun was the first to break the silence. He looked down at the Medal of Honor in its case, then back up at Rosa. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you mind if I shared something with you?" Rosa nodded, curious about what this young man wanted to say. "I served in Iraq," Chun said quietly. "2 tours with the Army. I've seen courage, I've seen people risk their lives for their friends. But what your husband did, that's something else entirely. That's the kind of bravery they write about in history books." The young soldier in dress blues stepped forward. "Ma'am, if it's okay with you, I'd like to stand at attention while you pack your husband's medal back in your bag. He deserves that respect." Before Rosa could answer, something unexpected happened. The businessman who had been worried about his flight schedule straightened up and stood at attention as well. Then the teenage boy did the same, followed by his mother. One by one, without any coordination or planning, the entire crowd began to stand straighter, showing their respect in the only way they knew how. Rodriguez felt her eyes filling with tears. In 20 years of airport security work, she had never seen anything like this. The busy terminal around them seemed to have paused, as if the entire building was holding its breath in honor of a man who had died years ago, but whose story was still inspiring people today. "Wait," Rodriguez said suddenly. "Mrs. Rosa, would you mind waiting just a few more minutes before you pack the metal away? I think there's someone who should meet you." Rodriguez stepped away from the crowd and pulled out her radio. She spoke quietly into it for a few moments, then returned to Rosa's side. "Ma'am, our airport director is a retired Air Force colonel. When he heard what was happening down here, he asked if he could come pay his respects. Would that be okay with you?" Rosa's eyes lit up. Of course it would. Miguel always respected all branches of service. He would be honored. While they waited, something beautiful began to happen. People in the crowd started talking to each other, sharing their own connections to military service. The businessman mentioned that his father had served in Korea, the mother traveling with her. Son revealed that her brother was currently deployed overseas. The young soldier began telling Rosa about his own experiences, and how her husband's story had given him a new perspective on what real courage looked like. Airport employees who had heard about the gathering began arriving with small tokens of respect. A gate agent brought a small American flag that normally decorated her desk. A maintenance worker offered Rosa a bottle of water, saying he just wanted to do something to help. Even passengers who were in danger of missing their flights seemed reluctant to leave. The airport director, Colonel Peterson, arrived within 10 minutes. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, still carrying himself with the bearing of a career military officer. When he approached Rosa, he removed his hat and held it respectfully at his side. "Mrs. Rosa," he said, "it would be my honor to meet the widow of a Medal of Honor recipient. Your husband's service to our country will never be forgotten." Rosa stood up to shake his hand, and Peterson gently took her arm to help her. "Colonel, thank you for coming. Miguel would have been so proud to meet you." Peterson looked down at the medal in its case. "Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to arrange something special. We have a VIP lounge here at the airport that's normally reserved for airline executives and dignitaries. I think today it should be reserved for someone much more important, the wife of an American hero." The crowd around them burst into spontaneous applause. Rosa looked overwhelmed by the gesture, but clearly touched by the kindness being shown to her. "There's more," Peterson continued. "I've contacted the Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter here in Denver. They're sending a representative with a flag that was flown over the Capitol building in Washington. It's our small way of honoring your husband's sacrifice and your journey today." Chun carefully closed the metal case and handed it back to Rosa. "Ma'am, it's been the greatest honor of my career to meet you and to learn about your husband. I'll never forget this day." Rodriguez helped Rosa pack her belongings back into her carry-on bag, handling everything with the same care and respect. She would show precious artifacts in a museum. "Mrs. Rosa, we're going to make sure you get to your gate with plenty of time to spare. And we're going to make sure the crew on your flight knows they have someone very special on board today." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Rosa one by one to thank her for sharing Miguel's story. The teenage boy shook her hand and told her he was going to write about this experience for his school history project. The businessman gave her his business card and asked if he could make a donation to a veteran's charity in Miguel's name. The young soldier in dress blues was the last to approach. "Ma'am," he said, "when I get back to my base, I'm going to tell my entire unit about your husband. Stories like his remind us why we serve." Rosa was escorted to the VIP lounge, where she found herself surrounded by airport staff, veterans organization representatives, and even the pilot who would be flying her plane to her granddaughter's graduation. Captain Williams was a former Navy pilot who had heard about Rosa's story through the airport's communication system. "Mrs. Rosa," Captain Williams said, "it would be my privilege to personally escort you to your seat when it's time to board. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to mention your husband's service to the other passengers. I think they should know they're flying with someone very special today." As Rosa sat in the comfortable VIP lounge, she felt overwhelmed by the kindness and respect that had been shown to Miguel's memory. She thought about the young men he had saved all those years ago, about the lives they had lived because of his courage. She thought about her granddaughter Anna, who was about to graduate from nursing school, ready to dedicate her life to helping others just like her grandfather had done. When it was time to board her flight, Rosa found herself escorted by Colonel Peterson, Captain Williams, and Officers Chun and Rodriguez. Other passengers in the gate area stood respectfully as she passed, many of them having heard about what had happened at the security checkpoint. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Captain Williams spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the honor of flying with Mrs. Rosa Martinez, the widow of Medal of Honor recipient Miguel Martinez. Sergeant Martinez served our country with extraordinary courage in Vietnam, saving the lives of 3 fellow soldiers. Mrs. Rosa is traveling today to watch her granddaughter graduate from college, carrying on the family tradition of service to others." The entire cabin burst into applause. Rosa felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy and pride. Miguel's story had touched so many people today, reminded them of the best qualities of human nature: courage, sacrifice, and love. As the plane climbed into the sky, Rosa held the medal case gently in her lap. She knew that Miguel would have been amazed by the honor shown to his memory today. But more than that, she knew he would have been proud that his story had inspired others, that his legacy of service and sacrifice was continuing to make a difference in the world. Tomorrow, she would watch Anna graduate and become a nurse, ready to dedicate her life to healing and helping others. It was a perfect continuation of Miguel's story, from saving lives on a battlefield in Vietnam to saving lives in hospitals and clinics across America. The medal in her lap represented the past, but Anna's graduation represented the future, and Rosa carried both with equal pride as she flew toward her granddaughter's greatest achievement.